The encounter. The rain fell in relentless sheets, a dark and heavy curtain that seemed to swallow the world. The neon signs above flickered weakly, casting their cold light onto the streets below. James Whitmore walked with purpose through the storm, his polished shoes splashing through puddles. The crisp wool of his coat clung to his body as the evening chill soaked into it, but he barely noticed. Thursday nights had become routine for him. Dinner alone at a quiet French restaurant, a bag of leftovers in hand, and the quiet walk home to an empty penthouse. 2 years had passed since Eleanor's death, and the emptiness in his heart still seemed to grow with each passing day. The apartment, once warm and filled with her laughter, now felt like a hollow shell. James had grown used to the silence, the stillness, the absence of life. It was easier that way. He could avoid the pain, avoid the reminders of what he had lost. But tonight, as the rain poured down and the streets were eerily quiet, something felt different. As he walked past a bus stop, a strange sight caught his attention. He almost didn't notice her at first, just a small, hunched figure, barely noticeable in the dim light. But something about it made James stop dead in his tracks. It wasn't a package, it wasn't a pile of trash. It was a child. A girl, no more than 5 years old, shivering violently on the metal bench. Her skin was pale, drenched in the rain that clung to her tiny body trembling despite the fever that was burning through her. Her pink sweater was too big, hanging loosely off her frail frame. One foot was bare, and the other was barely protected by a worn-out sneaker. Her wet braids clung to her face like wet strings, and her eyes, though clouded with fever, looked up at James in a desperate, silent plea. For a moment, James thought of walking past. It wasn't his problem, after all. People passed by her without a second glance, each of them too busy, too absorbed in their own lives to care. The world had a way of ignoring the broken, the forgotten, and the abandoned. He had learned that all too well. But something stopped him. An instinct, a whisper that urged him to look closer. James shifted his weight, the bag of leftovers growing heavier in his hand. His mind raced. He was a doctor, trained to help those in need. But he had stepped away from that life after Eleanor's death. He had left the hospital, shut off the part of him that cared. Yet now, in the stillness of the night, the medical instincts that had once been so sharp surged back to the surface. Fever, severe dehydration, pneumonia, perhaps. His thoughts raced through the list of symptoms even as his body stiffened, hesitant. He could call for help. Someone else could take care of her. He didn't need to get involved. But as if on cue, a voice, weak and frail, cut through the sound of the rain, sending a chill down his spine. "Mister, help me." James froze. His feet felt like lead. He could feel the rain soaking into his coat, his shoes, his soul. He stood there, the world around him spinning, torn between the life he had carefully built and the child who lay abandoned, alone, in the storm. He took a step back, another, as if trying to move away from the plea. But his heart betrayed him. "No," he whispered, almost to himself. "This isn't my problem." And yet, even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. They were hollow, a defense built to shield him from the inevitable. The doctor inside him couldn't ignore it. The child needed help. Slowly, almost reluctantly, James turned back toward her. As he knelt down beside her, the full weight of her condition hit him. Her small, feverish body was burning with heat, her face flushed a deep red. Her hands trembled as they clutched the worn fabric of her sweater. She was barely conscious, but her dark eyes locked onto his, a silent plea begging for help, for a way out of the misery she was trapped in. "Where are your parents?" he asked gently, trying to keep his voice steady. He didn't expect her to answer, not with the fever so high, not with the desperation in her eyes. But he had to try. The girl didn't speak, but her tiny hand, cold and shaking, reached out, gripping his coat sleeve. Her fingers were weak, trembling, but they held on as if she knew he was her only chance. James' heart ached. The cold rain, the distant sound of thunder rolling overhead, it all felt so insignificant in that moment. Here, crouching in front of this small child, he felt the weight of everything he had buried deep inside. The loss of his wife, the loneliness that had followed, the indifference of the world around him. It all came crashing down. He had spent so long hiding from the pain, locking himself away from the world. And now, standing in the rain with this child in his arms, he realized how hollow the decision had made him. Without thinking, he gathered her up, lifting her fragile body into his arms. She was light, almost too light, like she hadn't eaten in days. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her breath shallow and labored. He could feel the heat of her fever seeping through his clothes, and he knew that every moment counted. He turned, hailing a cab, but the driver refused to take them, shaking his head. "Sorry, mister," he said. "No sick kids, seats'll get ruined." James wasn't about to let that stop him. He straightened, his voice firm with the authority of someone who had spent years in command. "I'll pay triple the fare, and I'll cover the cleaning costs," he said. "Now open the door." The driver hesitated, but then, with a reluctant sigh, unlocked the door. James carefully maneuvered into the back seat, the girl still cradled in his arms. Her small body was burning, her pulse racing as her breathing grew more erratic. He had no idea how long she had been out in the rain, but he knew it was far too long. As the cab sped through the rain-soaked streets, James couldn't help but ask himself the question that had been nagging at him since he first stopped. What am I doing? But as the girl whimpered softly in his arms, her fever rising even higher, the answer came without hesitation. He wasn't just trying to save a child. He was doing what he should have done all along, what Eleanor would have wanted him to do. He was reaching out, breaking down the walls he had built around his heart, and taking the first step toward something bigger than himself. The hospital loomed ahead, its bright, sterile lights casting long shadows across the parking lot. But inside, James knew that what awaited him wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a test of everything he had come to believe about himself, about life, about what truly mattered. And in that moment, as the cab came to a screeching halt in front of the emergency room doors, James knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't going to walk away. The decision. The sterile scent of antiseptic hit James like a wall as he stepped through the sliding doors of Mount Sinai Hospital. The quiet hum of fluorescent lights above seemed almost oppressive in the stillness of the night. It was a typical late-night emergency room, bustling with tired nurses and doctors, but the cold clinical air felt suffocating, a far cry from the warmth he had tried to shield himself in over the years. It was a place that had once felt like home, his home. Yet tonight, it felt like a prison, both for him and the tiny feverish girl in his arms. Amara stirred in his arms, her feverish breathing more labored as she shifted uncomfortably. James tightened his grip on her, his mind racing through medical procedures. There was no time for hesitation now. This was a life-and-death situation, and he needed help. Quick. He walked straight toward the intake desk, his polished shoes clicking loudly against the floor. A nurse at the counter, barely glancing up from the computer screen, gave a brief acknowledgement. "I need help," James said, his voice carrying the urgency of a man who had seen too much suffering in his years as a doctor. "This child has a dangerous fever, and she needs immediate medical attention." The nurse looked at him blankly, then at the child in his arms. "Sir, you'll need to fill out these forms first," she said, sliding a clipboard toward him. Her tone was matter-of-fact, as though this was a typical request. James stared at the clipboard, then back at her. His chest tightened. "She needs help now. Not paperwork," he said, his voice rising slightly, a mix of disbelief and frustration in his chest. The cold reality of bureaucracy seemed to collide with the raw urgency of the moment. He couldn't understand how a system that was supposed to help could turn its back on someone in need. The nurse barely lifted her eyes. "Sir, Please fill out the forms. Without proper identification or a guardian, we can't treat her. Hospital policy. James clenched his jaw. Hospital policy. It was infuriating. He had spent his entire life treating patients, saving lives, and now he stood on the other side of the table, helpless. She's just a child, James said, the frustration in his voice undeniable. He could feel the heat of Amara's body burning through his coat, and he knew the longer they stood here, the more likely it was that she would slip into a worse condition. His mind was spinning. She's been through enough already. How could they let her suffer any longer? I'm not leaving her here, he said, his tone dropping, turning cold with resolve. She's been abandoned. I found her at a bus stop. She's sick. You have to help her. The nurse finally looked up at him, her expression impassive, but James could see the flicker of something in her eyes. She looked down at Amara and then back at him, as if measuring him. I understand your concerns, sir, she said slowly, but without proper documentation, we can't proceed. It's the law. James felt his hands begin to shake, but he didn't move. His mind raced. He had been a surgeon for decades, saving lives in seconds, making decisions in the heat of the moment. And yet here he was, facing a policy that might mean the difference between life and death for this child. Call someone, James said, his voice strained. Do something. The nurse nodded mechanically. I'll notify the supervisor, but you'll need to sit and wait. He took a seat in the empty waiting area, Amara's small body cradled in his arms. The sterile waiting room felt cold and alien, too quiet, the white walls closing in on him. His suit, soaked from the rain, clung to his body, and his mind wandered, searching for any loophole that might allow him to save this girl. Minutes passed like hours as James stared at Amara's face. Her small features were pale, her eyelids fluttering as she fought against the fever. Her tiny fingers twitched occasionally, but she remained silent. The chaos of his thoughts grew louder in the silence. What had happened to her? Who had left her out there in the rain? What was she running from? The doors to the back room opened, and a man in a white coat emerged. He was older, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed back, a professional air about him that suggested years of experience in handling crisis. But there was something about him, something in his gaze, that made James wary. Dr. Whitmore, I assume, the man said, approaching with a clipboard in hand. James stood up immediately, his posture rigid with frustration and exhaustion. Yes, James replied, his voice still strained. This child needs immediate treatment. She was found abandoned at a bus stop. I'm a doctor, and I understand. The doctor interrupted, holding up a hand. He glanced at the clipboard. I'm Dr. Harris. I've reviewed the situation. James felt a sense of dread knot in his stomach. Dr. Harris was the supervisor, the one who would decide whether or not Amara would get the care she so desperately needed. You're telling me that this child has been abandoned, with no identification, no guardian? Dr. Harris asked, looking between James and the feverish child in his arms. His expression was clinical, almost detached. That's right, James said. She was left alone. She's burning with fever. I've been a surgeon for over 40 years. I know the signs. She's in danger. Dr. Harris nodded slowly, but there was a strange look in his eyes, something cold, something unreadable. Without identification or a guardian, Dr. Harris continued, we can't admit her. The law is clear. We need her parents, or at least documentation, to proceed. He paused, allowing the words to hang in the air. James's frustration boiled over. I'm not going to let her die because of paperwork, he shouted, his voice carrying a rare edge of desperation. He could feel the tension in his chest tighten. The calm precision of his surgical career was slipping through his fingers. Dr. Harris' expression didn't change, but James could see the faintest hint of something in his eyes. Pity, perhaps. Or was it judgment? You're a doctor, Dr. Harris said, his tone turning cold. You know the system. You know the rules. We can't break them. We can't just treat someone because they've been abandoned. There's a protocol to follow." James shook his head in disbelief, his hand tightening around the clipboard in his grasp. She was abandoned in the rain. She's feverish. She's dehydrated. What are we doing here if we're not saving lives? Dr. Harris glanced at the child again, his gaze flicking back to James. "I can't authorize treatment without proper documentation." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. James could hear the beeping of monitors in the background, the soft murmur of nurses, the quiet rhythm of footsteps echoing through the halls. And then, a small sound from Amara, barely audible, a tiny voice barely breaking through the fever. "Please, don't leave me." The words were like a dagger to James's heart. He turned his head to look at her. Her tiny face was flushed, her body still trembling in his arms. Her eyes opened for the briefest of moments, glazed with fever and then closed again. She was clinging to him with a strength that made him ache. This was no longer just about paperwork. This was about a child in need, a soul in pain. Dr. Harris took a step back, and for a moment, James thought he might turn and walk away. But then something shifted in the air, a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the doctor's demeanor. "All right," Dr. Harris said, his voice softening just slightly. "We'll get her a bed. But we still need to find her parents, or at least get in touch with authorities." James didn't care about the rest of the procedure anymore. He had just won a small victory in this sterile war against bureaucracy. And for now, that was enough. He glanced down at Amara, her small body nestled against him, her breathing shallow but steady. "We'll figure this out," James whispered, his voice low and firm. As the nurses began to prepare a bed for her, James felt the weight of his decision settle in. There was no turning back now. He had already walked too far down this path. The question now wasn't whether he could save her. It was whether he would have the strength to protect her, to fight for her, against a system that was more concerned with rules than lives. And as he followed the nurses down the hall, the overwhelming truth hit him. For the first time in years, he wasn't walking alone. The fight. The sterile white walls of the hospital felt even more suffocating now. James followed the nurses down a long, quiet corridor, his shoes echoing sharply against the polished floor. The room they directed him to was dimly lit, an open space filled with medical equipment and the faint peeping of monitors. It smelled of antiseptic, of life and death, of waiting. Amara, her small body burning with fever, had been settled into a bed in the corner. James stood by her side, his fingers lightly brushing the damp curls of her hair as he watched her sleep. The child's face was flushed, her breathing shallow, and though her body shivered from the fever, there was a calmness to her features now, perhaps the faintest glimmer of peace, however fragile. The room was quiet, save for the quiet murmurs of the nurses outside and the constant, reassuring beeps of the monitors. But inside, everything was different. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with a strange unease, as though something was about to break. James paced slowly around the room, his mind whirring. He had done everything he could. He had brought her here, insisted on her treatment, fought against the cold, uncaring system. But the moment the hospital doors had closed behind him, a new wave of reality had hit. There were no quick fixes, no easy answers. The systems he had once been a part of, the ones that had once been a source of control and certainty, now seemed foreign to him. He could feel his frustration building again. The cold stares from the hospital staff, the thinly veiled judgment, the lack of concern for Amara's condition. It made his blood boil. For all his years as a respected surgeon, this felt different. His medical training wasn't enough. His credentials didn't matter. He had been reduced to nothing more than a desperate man trying to save a child, with no clear path ahead. The door opened, and Dr. Harris entered, his face impassive, but with a slight wrinkle of concern at the edges of his brow. His usual calm demeanor was now tinged with something else, perhaps uncertainty or a begrudging respect. He glanced at James, who was standing by the bedside, his gaze never leaving Amara. "How is she?" James asked, his voice more controlled than he felt. He didn't trust himself to say more, to sound too desperate. He needed answers. "She's stable for now," Dr. Harris replied, though his tone lacked the usual confidence James had once expected. "Her fever's come down a bit, but it's still dangerously high. We've administered fluids, trying to bring her back to a baseline. But she's malnourished, dehydrated. It's a delicate situation." James nodded, his eyes never leaving Amara's small form. She had shifted slightly in the bed, her feverish body still twitching with the aftermath of the trauma she had suffered. The silence between them was heavy. "What now?" James asked. "What happens next?" Dr. Harris glanced at his clipboard, taking his time before responding. "We're continuing the treatment, monitoring her condition. But there's more to this than just the physical. The child has no identification, no family. We can't proceed with long-term care unless we involve the authorities." James's heart skipped a beat. The authorities. He had been dreading this. He had known that her lack of identification would lead them to the system, to social services, but he couldn't bring himself to accept that. Not after seeing the fear in her eyes, not after everything he had witnessed. She was just a child, no more than a fragile little girl who needed love, safety, and stability. How could anyone think of sending her into the unknown, to a system that would chew her up and spit her out? "I'm not sending her to foster care," James said, his voice low but filled with unshakable determination. "I'm not letting her become just another number, another lost case in the system." Dr. Harris raised an eyebrow. "You can't just keep her here, James. Without proper documentation, we're legally required to notify child services. This isn't up to you." James's hand tightened on the edge of the bed, his knuckles whitening. "I've seen the system, Dr. Harris. I know what happens to children like her. They get shuffled around, they get lost. They don't stand a chance. I'm not going to let that happen to her." The room seemed to grow colder with every word James spoke. Dr. Harris didn't respond immediately, his eyes searching James's face as if weighing his words. Finally, he spoke, though his tone was softer now, almost reluctant. "I understand your concern, James," he said, "but you're not thinking clearly. This isn't a simple decision. It's a complicated legal matter. There are processes in place for a reason. You can't just override them." James's chest tightened as he felt the familiar weight of helplessness pressing against him. His years as a doctor had prepared him for saving lives in emergencies, for making critical decisions under pressure. But this was different. This was a fight against a system that didn't care about his ability to save lives. It didn't care about his intentions. All it saw was red tape, procedures, rules. "I can't just leave her," James said, his voice cracking slightly. He glanced down at Amara, who was still unconscious, her small hand clutching the edge of the blanket. "She trusts me. She's starting to feel safe for the first time in God knows how long. You're telling me to throw her back into the fire?" Dr. Harris didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned away and walked to the desk, scribbling something on the notepad there. The tension in the room thickened, each second feeling like an eternity. James could feel the weight of the decisions pressing down on him, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't walk away. When Dr. Harris finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost sympathetic. "You're not the only one who cares about this child, James, but we all have to play by the rules. I'll help you, as much as I can, but we need to contact Child Protective Services. There's no other way." James stood there, frozen, his mind racing. Contacting social services meant starting the cycle. It meant involving the very system he feared would break her. But if he didn't, he risked losing her anyway. He risked her becoming a nameless face in the crowd, left to slip through the cracks. The door creaked open, and a young nurse stepped inside. She had a clipboard in her hand, and her expression was serious. "Dr. Harris, we've completed the initial scans," she said. "There's something you need to see." Dr. Harris nodded, and motioned for James to follow. The nurse led them down the hall to another small office. There, a computer screen blinked to life as Dr. Harris pulled up the scan results. "Her blood work came back," Dr. Harris said, scrolling through the information on the screen. "Her liver function is impaired, likely from long-term malnutrition. She's got a history of anemia." "But," he paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "But what?" James asked, his heart in his throat. Dr. Harris hesitated for a moment before turning to face him. "There's something else. We found a scar. It's small, but it's deep. It looks like a burn wound. It's healed, but the scarring suggests it happened a while ago." James felt his stomach drop. His mind raced back to the sight of Amara on that bus stop bench, the trembling, feverish child who seemed to cower at the slightest touch. He had known, on some level, that there was more to her story, but now, hearing it confirmed, the weight of the truth hit him like a sledgehammer. "Where did she get it?" James asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Harris's eyes darkened. "I don't know yet, but it's clear that this child has been through more than just abandonment. She's been hurt, and it's going to take more than medical treatment to help her." James stood still, his mind reeling with the implications. There was so much more to this child's story than he could have imagined. The trauma she had endured, the pain she had hidden behind her wide eyes. It was a story he was only beginning to unravel. "I'm not walking away," James said, his voice steady and firm. "I'm not giving her up. I'll do whatever it takes." Dr. Harris sighed, his gaze softening just slightly. "I'm not going to stop you, but you need to understand, this isn't just about medicine. It's about protecting her, about giving her a chance at something better than what she's known." James nodded, his eyes fixed on Amara, who lay in the bed, her body still trembling slightly as she slept. He could feel the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was no stranger to challenges. And this time, there was more than just his own life at stake. It was her life, and he would fight for it. The decision and the dilemma. The morning light filtered weakly through the hospital window, casting long, soft shadows across the sterile white walls. The room was quiet, save for the steady beep of the monitor next to Amara's bed and the faint rustling of nurses moving down the hall. James stood beside her, his eyes never leaving her frail form. His hand was gently placed on her small, trembling arm, offering what little comfort he could as she slept, fever still burning in her body. He hadn't slept in hours, maybe days. The weight of what was happening was pressing down on him in ways that felt unbearable. He had saved lives before, had performed surgeries that kept patients from dying on the table, had pulled people back from the edge of death. But nothing had prepared him for this. Fighting for the life of a child who had been left out in the rain, abandoned and broken. His fight now was not against a disease or injury, but against an entire system that saw Amara as little more than paperwork. The door creaked open, and a nurse entered, carrying a tray of medication and more supplies. She glanced at James, offering him a tired smile before checking the machines and adjusting a few things. "Good morning, Dr. Whitmore," she said quietly. "I see you're still here. How's the little one doing?" James didn't reply immediately. His eyes stayed focused on Amara, the faint rise and fall of her chest, reminding him just how fragile she was. "She's hanging on," he said at last, his voice tight. "We've stabilized her for now. But the next few days are critical. Her body's been through so much. The fever's still high, and the dehydration's concerning." The nurse nodded solemnly, glancing over at the IV lines attached to Amara's arm. "She's a fighter," the nurse said gently, "but there's only so much we can do. You should know that if she remains unconscious much longer, we may need to consider other options." James stiffened at the word options. He didn't want to hear it. "She's not just a case file," he replied, his voice low, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "She's a child, and she's mine to protect." The nurse hesitated, her expression softening with understanding. "Of course, Dr. Whitmore. But you need to be prepared. The social workers will be here soon. They'll want to know what you plan to do next. If you're not her guardian, you can't just keep her here indefinitely. They'll want answers." James felt his heart sink into his stomach. The reality of the situation was dawning on him more every minute. He could fight the system, push against it, try to protect her for as long as possible. But eventually, the law would catch up with him. Eventually, Amara would be taken from him, and she'd be sent into the foster system, where she'd be lost in a bureaucracy that would only use her as another statistic. "I'm not sending her to foster care," he said firmly, more to himself than to the nurse. "I won't let that happen." The nurse gave him a sympathetic look, but said nothing. She simply adjusted Amara's blanket and left the room, leaving James alone with his thoughts. The silence was almost unbearable now. What had he gotten himself into? He had always thought of himself as a man who could control situations. As a doctor, as a surgeon, his entire life had been about precision, about making the right decisions. He had lived by a set of rules, rules that had kept him going after Eleanor's death. But now, standing in the hospital room with this little girl who had nowhere else to turn, he realized that the rules meant nothing anymore. There were no procedures, no protocols, no charts to guide him. He was flying blind, and everything was at stake. A soft knock on the door broke his reverie, and he turned to see a familiar face. It was Officer Jenkins, the police officer who had been with the hospital's intake team the night he had arrived with Amara. His uniform was slightly rumpled from the late hours, but there was a grim seriousness in his expression. "Dr. Whitmore," Jenkins said, stepping inside. "Got a minute?" James nodded, stepping back to allow him to enter. His chest tightened, his mind running through the possibilities. What now? More red tape, more bureaucracy. Jenkins closed the door behind him, his eyes studying James carefully before he spoke. "I've been asked to take a statement," Jenkins began, his voice low. "I know this situation is complicated, but the hospital's required to report this. We need to know more about how you found the girl." James stiffened. He knew where this was headed. "I already told the hospital staff everything they needed to know," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I understand," Jenkins said, his eyes softening slightly. "But they need more than just a story, Doc. They're going to want proof, documentation. They're going to ask how you came into contact with her, how you brought her here, how she got to that bus stop. They'll want names, addresses, and answers about her family." James felt his blood run cold. He couldn't give them any of that. He didn't have it. Amara had no family, no history. She was a mystery, an abandoned child with nothing but the clothes on her back. "I didn't ask for this," James said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't ask to find her in the street, alone, dying. I didn't ask for any of this." Jenkins held up his hands, trying to calm the tension in the room. "I'm not blaming you, Doc. It's just that the hospital's covering their bases. They need to know where she came from. And right now, they're treating this as an abandonment case. They'll be bringing social services in soon to assess her situation." James's heart clenched. Social services. He could feel the weight of that term like a stone in his chest. He had heard horror stories about foster care, about children shuffled from home to home, never knowing what it was like to feel safe, to feel loved. Amara had already been through so much. He couldn't let her go through that again. "I don't care about the paperwork," James said fiercely, his voice low. "She's not leaving this hospital unless I say so. You understand me?" Jenkins looked at him for a long moment, studying him with a look that was both cautious and respectful. "I understand," he said quietly, "but you're going to have to do things the right way if you want to keep her. You'll need to prove you can provide for her. You'll need a lawyer. You'll need documentation. If she's going to stay with you, it's going to take more than just good intentions." James swallowed hard. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. Jenkins nodded slowly. I'll make sure the right people know what's going on. But you need to be prepared. This won't be easy." The officer paused at the door, giving James one last look before he left. "Good luck, Doc. I think she's got a chance with you. Don't blow it." James stood alone in the room once more, his thoughts whirling. He didn't know how he was going to do it, but he had no choice. He couldn't let Amara slip through his fingers. He would fight. He would fight for her. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from his lawyer, Paul Kingston. "Meeting tomorrow morning. We need a strategy. Call me when you get this." James didn't hesitate. He hit call and waited as the phone rang. "James." Paul's voice came through, deep and calm. "I take it you've got some updates." "I've got plenty," James said, his voice tight with resolve. "I need you to prepare for a fight, Paul. We're going to need every advantage we can get, and I'm not backing down." "All right," Paul replied, his tone steady. "I'll get everything ready on my end. I'll see you tomorrow. You don't have to do this alone." James hung up, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't alone, not anymore. But the road ahead was going to be long, and the obstacles in his path were growing by the second. But in that moment, as he looked at the small, fragile figure in the bed, the decision was clear. He would do whatever it took. He would fight for Amara, no matter the cost. The unseen struggle. The morning sunlight filtered through the hospital curtains, casting a soft, golden hue on the sterile walls. The world outside was alive, full of motion and noise, but inside the hospital room, time seemed to slow to a crawl. The air was thick with tension, as if everything in the room held its breath, waiting for something to change. James Whitmore sat in a chair beside Amara's bed, his fingers tracing the edge of the blanket that covered her small, feverish body. She lay motionless, her skin still burning with fever, her small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. For the first time since he had found her, he wasn't sure if she was going to make it. The IV drip, still hanging from the pole beside her bed, had kept her hydrated through the night, but her body was still weak. Her fever had not broken as he had hoped. The doctors had done all they could, but they were running out of time. The doctors had spoken about the possibility of a coma, of how the fever, combined with the trauma of the previous days, might send her into an irreversible state. James refused to let that possibility settle in. He hadn't saved lives for 40 years to give up on a child in need. But it wasn't just the fever that worried him. It was everything else. The unknowns that clung to Amara like the dampness of the rain that night. No parents. No ID. No trace of her life before the bus stop. It was as though she had appeared from nowhere, as if the world had discarded her, and James had been the one to pick up the pieces. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from Paul Kingston, the lawyer he had reached out to. The text was brief, but its implications were heavy. "I scheduled a meeting for this afternoon. We need to start getting your case together. Social services is moving fast, and we need to be ready." James stared at the screen for a long moment, the weight of the words sinking in. Social services, the same system that had failed Amara before. The same system that would treat her like a case number. And if they took her from him, she would be lost. Gone. He couldn't let that happen. He stood up, taking one last look at Amara before stepping out of the room. The hallway was quiet, and he moved quickly, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. He needed to meet Paul. He needed a plan, and he needed one fast. The law office was a far cry from the sterile white halls of the hospital. It was warm, with deep wood paneling and plush chairs that gave it the feel of a place where people made decisions that could change lives. James had been here before, many times, signing contracts, reviewing papers, finalizing details. But today, he wasn't here for a business deal. He was here for something far more important. Paul Kingston, a seasoned lawyer with salt and pepper hair and sharp, calculating eyes, rose from behind his large desk as James entered. He looked at him, offering a steady, no-nonsense handshake. "James," Paul said, his voice low but full of gravity. "I've been reviewing everything. We're going to need to move quickly." James nodded, not trusting himself to speak right away. He wasn't sure how to articulate the mess he found himself in, but Paul wasn't waiting for him to find the words. He pulled out a folder from his desk, flipping through it with practiced ease, his eyes skimming over the legal notes he had made. "The hospital's already reported the child to social services, as you know," Paul began. "They'll want to place her in foster care, and you'll have to prove you can provide for her. We're looking at a battle on two fronts, legally and emotionally." James felt the room close in around him. This wasn't just a fight for Amara's future. This was a fight for her dignity, for her chance at a normal life. And he was her only chance. He felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders, heavier than ever before. "We'll need to show them that the system isn't a safe option," Paul continued, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying the concern he was trying to hide. "You're a man of means, James, but you're also in your 60s. And let's be blunt. The courts are going to have concerns about your age, about your ability to care for a young child." James clenched his jaw, the bitterness rising in his throat. He had worked his entire life, saved countless lives, and yet here he was, being questioned about his ability to care for one child, a child who needed him. "I don't care about my age," he said, his voice sharp. "I care about her." Paul studied him for a moment before speaking again. "I know, but we need to make that case. You need to show that you can provide the stability and care Amara needs, that you're the best person for her. This isn't just about paperwork. It's about proving that she belongs with you." James swallowed hard. He had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to let Amara slip away from him. But the reality was sinking in. This was going to be harder than anything he had ever faced. The courtroom battles, the legal hoops he'd have to jump through. It was more than he had signed up for. But the thought of Amara, of her dark eyes looking at him with silent trust, kept him grounded. "I'll do whatever it takes," James said firmly, his voice unwavering. "I won't let them take her." Paul sighed, pushing the folder aside. "I'll start making calls. We'll get character witnesses. I'll contact child psychologists who can assess your ability to care for her, and we'll prepare a petition. But this will take time. It's a process, and the system is slow. In the meantime, you'll need to continue showing them that you can be her guardian. They'll want to see that you can provide a stable environment. That means routines, stability, and yes, proof that you can meet her needs emotionally." James nodded, absorbing the weight of Paul's words. The fight ahead would be long and hard, and there were no guarantees. But one thing was certain: he wasn't backing down. He would not lose her. "I'll get started on the paperwork," Paul said, standing up from his desk and offering a reassuring smile. "I know this isn't easy, James, but you're not alone in this." James rose, shaking Paul's hand with a firm grip. "Thank you. I'll be in touch." The drive back to the hospital was a blur. James's thoughts were racing, each one more overwhelming than the last. He had known that this would be difficult, but now that he was in the thick of it, it felt like he was wading through a swamp of endless paperwork, legalities, and uncertainty. As he pulled into the parking lot of the hospital, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from the social worker who had been assigned to Amara's case. "I'll be meeting you at the hospital in 1 hour. We need to discuss the next steps for Amara's care." The word sent a chill down his spine. Social services was coming. The inevitable moment had arrived. He stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of the situation settle in. The fight had just begun. Back in Amara's room, things had taken a turn. The nurses had been monitoring her closely, and now the situation seemed even more urgent. The fever had worsened. Amara was still unconscious, her body trembling despite the blankets wrapped tightly around her. James stepped inside, his heart racing. He moved to her side, taking her tiny hand into his. The heat of her skin almost burned him, but he didn't flinch. "She's strong," he whispered to her. "You're going to make it. I won't let them take you." The door opened behind him, and Dr. Harris entered, his face grave. "Dr. Whitmore," he said quietly, "we're doing everything we can. But Amara's condition is critical. We need to decide on a course of action quickly." James turned to face him, his jaw clenched. "I won't leave her. I'm not going anywhere." Dr. Harris gave him a long, steady look. "You're right, James. She needs you. But the system is going to make this difficult. We're going to have to fight." And in that moment, James realized that the fight wasn't just for Amara's survival, it was for her future. And he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. The road ahead would be difficult. The challenges would be fierce. But James knew one thing for sure. Amara was his, and he would protect her with everything he had.